Well, let's start with that meaning crisis concept from the 2024 notes. It frames it as the dilemma of our time, really.
Yeah.
It puts it as the challenge of figuring out what has the most meaning for everyone present in the now.
Everyone present in the now. That's specific, not just personal meaning, but collective.
Yeah, it points towards something shared, something immediate. And it connects us directly to people. Musicians are mentioned specifically, actively looking for meaning to attach to, like it's a real conscious search.
A need people feel. And this connects to identity too, right? The notes mention adaptation.
They do. There's this idea of advice like be the person that, the person you admire or the adaptable one.
Be the change you want to see, that kind of thing.
Sort of, but the notes immediately question how feasible that actually is.
Right. Sounds good on paper, but...
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's a great example from an interview with Vinnie Colaiuta and Bill Bruford.
The drummers.
Yeah, talking about session work.
All right.
They described struggling to play parts exactly how producers wanted them, even though they're, incredible musicians.
So just being adaptable wasn't enough.
It highlights how tough that can be when you're up against really specific external demands. It challenges that simple can-do idea.
What gets in the way? Is it skill or just the producer's vision being impossible to match?
Maybe a bit of both.
Yeah.
But the notes make this really interesting point. Sometimes the system itself isn't set up for success.
How so?
Well, like that drummer example.
Yeah.
You try your best, give it everything.
Yeah.
But the situation, the constraints, they mean there's just no satisfying payoff for the musician. It doesn't quite land.
Huh. That sounds incredibly frustrating. It makes me think about something else in the material archetypes.
Ah, yes, from the Medium article. Themes in movies as relating to archetypes.
Yeah. Does that mean we're expected to fit an archetype, not just be ourselves?
That's the question raised, definitely. Are we trying to slot into a predefined role? And does that apply to music, too? Like sonic archetypes?
You mean like a guitarist is supposed to sound this way, a drummer that way?
Precisely. And there's a really stark example given. A bass player being told they weren't black enough because they didn't slap.
Wow.
Yeah. It shows how people can fixate on this perceived, archetypal power, the slap-style stereotype, and totally ignore the actual function of the bass in the music.
That's really problematic. Focusing on a stereotype over the actual job.
And it loops back to that vague advice. Be the person. What does that even mean if the expectation is based on something so superficial or restrictive? The notes call that idea vague and mercurial.
Because the target keeps shifting, or it's based on, prejudice in that case.
Right. There's this constant tension between your own way of doing things and what the outside world seems to demand.
Okay, so that's a big tension. And the material connects this to wider societal shifts, too.
It does. It brings in Caroline Myss's view on the post-nuclear age.
What's the idea there?
That it shifted our collective psychology, pushed us more towards individualism, looking inward and maybe away from the collective focus.
Turning inward. How would that make it harder to fit those external, maybe collective expectations in music or other fields?
Well, if your focus is more internal, on your own expression or what feels right to you, it could easily clash with demands to just fit into a preset group role or archetype.
Makes sense. Less willingness to just bend to fit the mold.
Maybe less desire to, or maybe it just feels more difficult if your primary orientation is inward.
Okay, so we've got the meaning crisis, identity struggles, archetypes, individualism.
Yeah.
Now, the notes from July 31st, 2024, they pivot towards tech, right? AI specifically.
Yeah, they really get into how AI impacts creativity and, crucially, meaning.
What's the argument?
The core idea presented is that AI art generation often uses the same underlying methods for everyone, kind of standardizes the process.
So less room for individual struggle, discovery,
Yeah.
that unique journey.
Exactly. And the thinking is this standardization reduces chances for genuine flow, that state where you're totally absorbed,
Right, losing yourself in the work.
And if you lose the opportunities for flow, the argument goes the creative act itself starts to feel less meaningful.
So the meaning crisis is this lack of meaning.
Yes.
And AI, in this view, might actually be removing meaning from the very activities that could help address that crisis.
It's a real paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're searching for meaning, and this technology seems to offer production without the potentially meaningful doing part. It kind of hollows it out.
So what fills that space then? The notes mention entertainment.
Yeah, drowning in it. It draws a line from the invention of the TV remote right up to today's infinite scroll on streaming platforms.
Oh, I know that feeling. Scrolling. Scrolling, can't decide.
And then you just give up and watch whatever's there to fill the time.
Totally. Passive consumption.
And the argument here is that this constant passive intake saps our motivation to actually do creative things ourselves. Painting, writing, music.
Why bother when perfection is just a click away?
It feels like it's all been done, maybe. Like
Right.
the creative space is already full, saturated.
Yeah, you can see infinite versions of anything almost instantly. What's left to add?
The notes use this analogy. AI art is like ordering food on an app.
Convenient consumption.
Right. But what happens after you consume it? What fills the space left behind? The implication is often just more scrolling,
A cycle of passivity. So what's the antidote offered in the material?
getting engaged, doing things manually. That's presented as the way out.
Actually picking up a paintbrush or an instrument.
Yes. There's a personal example shared how picking up instruments, even briefly, boosts mood, whereas going back to scrolling brings on a kind of depressive feeling.
A direct contrast. Felt experience.
It poses this question. If everything can be generated automatically, what's actually left for us humans to do that feels worthwhile. And the notes acknowledge, some people might like the idea of not having to do anything, just be.
Sure, I can see the appeal.
But the author's stance, as presented, is a preference for doing, because the action itself brings joy.
So maybe we're creating not just for the outcome, but for the joy of the process itself. Almost like therapy for the passivity.
That's certainly a question that hangs in the air, this idea that automatic creation leaves a vacuum. And when everything feels easily generated, feels been there, done that, this vacuum appears.
And this vacuum leads to media revivals like cassettes.
Exactly. The notes mention cassettes specifically. The author finds it a bit odd, having lived through that era.
Right, not exactly high fidelity.
No. But the explanation offered is that it fills that vacuum. For older people, maybe it's nostalgia.
Remembering the before time.
But for younger generations, the idea is it's actually a new experience, something physical, manual, tangible.
Something you have to actively engage with, not just stream passively.
Right. Holding the object, pressing play, it fills a void left by the purely digital.
That makes sense. It feels like wanting to return to something solid after, say, a big disruption changes everything.
That's precisely the analogy used, which leads into the idea of urban renewal.
Tearing down old buildings, putting up new ones.
Yeah. But the notes highlight the psychological impact. For older people who knew the before.
They see the loss, the destruction of the familiar.
Exactly. There's a disruption, maybe even damage. But younger generations,
They just see the new buildings. That is normal to them.
they assume it was always like that. It shows how only seeing the new without the context of the old really shapes your whole perception. You miss the history, the layers,
And maybe the meaning embedded in the old ways.
perhaps. Which brings us back to those historical sources you gathered. Herring, the Beatles, Anne Frank.
How do they fit into this bigger picture?
They're presented as these powerful examples of individuals doing, creating, finding meaning through action and reflection, often in really challenging circumstances. Keith Haring's journals give you this raw look at his process, his influences, him grappling with it all, real-time creative struggle and thought.
The Beatles documents show them actively messing with studio tech, right? Finding new sounds by hand, essentially.
Constantly experimenting, evolving through manual interaction. That's active engagement with the tools.
And Anne Frank. Her diary is about finding meaning through writing, observing, reflecting, even when trapped.
In an incredibly constrained situation, yes. It shows that search for meaning, for identity, through internal work, through documenting her reality, a profound act of doing through writing.
So they all embody this idea of active engagement, finding meaning through the process in their own ways.
Exactly. And then the contemporary 2025 entries from February, June, October, March, May,
What do they show?
they show people now wrestling with similar themes. The notes mention reflections on political stuff, social divisions,
Okay.
the nature of creativity today, and this ongoing intersection of art, technology, language. It just confirms these are live issues, things people are grappling with right now. We're reporting that impartially, of course, just what's in the source material.
Right. So we've gone from the meaning crisis and identity pressure through AI's impact and passive consumption to these examples of active creation across different times. It's quite a journey.
It really ties together, and it leaves you thinking, doesn't it? If this new tech landscape often hides the old ways,
Right.
the manual effort, the history,
Yeah.
and if knowing that past changes how we see the present.
Then what are we potentially losing if we only see the new world, the world of easy consumption, automatic generation?
Without really connecting with the doing, the manual work, the history that built it all.
How does that affect our own search for meaning?